Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Planning for Retirement podcast, where we help educate you on how retirement works. This is episode 44, How Much Will I Spend in Retirement? My name is Kevin Lau. I'm your host. I've been a financial planning practitioner for about 15 years and have a passion for education, which is what this podcast is all about. Our mission is to educate you to increase clarity and confidence to achieve financial security. I'm also the owner of Imagine Financial Security, which is an independent financial planning and investment management firm based in Florida. However, this information is for educational purposes only and should not be used as investment, legal, or tax advice. Welcome to today's show, everybody. I appreciate you all tuning in. Thank you to all of our listeners out there. We appreciate all of you, especially the ones who have followed our show and the ones who have left a 5-star review. We really appreciate that. It helps us reach more people and impact more people, which is what this show is all about. I am not a professional content creator, okay? So let me put that out there. I barely have time to do preparation and record these shows every 2 weeks. So I'm recording this on a Sunday afternoon, actually, while my 3 boys, quote unquote, nap before we hit the pool later on today. So happy Memorial Day to all of you out there. Thank you to all of the servicemen and women who gave the ultimate sacrifice to serve our country. We appreciate you. We appreciate your family members. If you do find value in our show, or if you have found value in the show, we appreciate that 5-star review, and we appreciate you giving the show a share. Share this with a colleague, share this with a family member or a friend who is approaching retirement. The majority of our listeners are between the ages of, I would say, 50 and 70. And the majority of our listeners, I would say, are in the upper threshold with income and net worth, and folks that have done a diligent job saving and accumulating and want to really optimize and get dialed in before putting that notice in to your employer and say, hey, I am officially retiring. Or maybe it's, hey, I have the ability to retire if I wanted to. Now I'm work optional. Not that you're going to retire, but it's nice to have that option to be in a position where you could quit if you wanted to today. Okay. And so that's where we're trying to get you to. All right. And so last show, we had talked about planning for a normal retirement age and how that is a mistake, because the majority of the time, more oftentimes than not, individuals retire earlier than expected. Okay. So that is a key ingredient. If you're working with a financial advisor and you're going to them and saying, hey, I want to retire at this date, that is a big impact. That makes a big impact on some of the inputs that you need to put in, like how much you've already saved and invested, or how much of your gross income are you going to be saving and investing until you hit retirement. Okay. So very key input is the retirement date. And then the other key input that is super important, or one of the other key inputs, is how much will you spend in retirement? And so that's what we're going to try to unpack today, because we're in review season with our clients and even with folks that we've been working with for a number of years. We find that people do not like to track a budget. Okay. It's very difficult, or maybe one spouse likes to track the budget and the other spouse puts their head in the sand. This is not uncommon. Okay. So don't beat yourself up on this topic if you're one of those people. It's the majority of individuals are not Excel budget trackers. They're not tracking with YNAB or Monarch Money and optimizing exactly every budget category. And that's okay. We can still come up with a solid foundation for a retirement income plan without going through a detailed budget. And we'll talk about some of the rules of thumb out there, some of the hacks that you can get to what your spending need is in retirement quickly without going through line item by line item in terms of how much you spent at Starbucks or how much you spent on eating out over the last 3 to 6 months. Okay, so we're going to talk about some of those rules of thumb. We're going to talk about the key observations that we see, when real clients of ours are in retirement, what they're actually experiencing. Okay. Because when I read online or in publications, financial planning magazines, I think this idea of retirement spending it's so difficult to just fit everyone into the same category and say, hey, this is your trajectory. Here's the rule of thumb. Follow this rule of thumb throughout retirement. Everyone's unique. Everyone has different income streams for retirement. Everyone has a different time horizon in terms of when they retire and how long they are going to live in retirement. Different legacy goals, okay, that they might have in terms of leaving money to their children or grandchildren, or maybe it's charitable impact. So there's no one size fits all in this one. So I'm going to talk about some of the key observations that I see. And then lastly, I'm going to talk a little bit about my favorite way to plan for a retirement spending budget. Okay. And so we'll talk about that at the very end. But that's really it today. But before I jump in, I mentioned we are in review season. Okay. And so, frankly, I probably could have done a podcast episode on every single one of these, but I wrote down 3 observations that I noticed this past week with clients that we're working with or new clients that we're just onboarding. And I just wanted to say, hey, let me just do a quick little best practices. There's 3 of them that I wrote down. Best practices that you can take away that's not even necessarily related to this topic today, but hopefully these are also additional value adds, again, as you're getting your financial house in order. So the number 1 is check your beneficiaries. Okay. Check those beneficiaries on all of those retirement accounts, all of your life insurance accounts, all of your pension income sources. Okay. This is something I see is oftentimes overlooked, not only by clients, but also financial advisors. I was reviewing a statement with a new client looking at their beneficiaries, both primary and contingent, and they were out of date, even though they had been working with the financial advisor in the past. Okay. Additionally, we just onboarded a couple of new clients, and one of which skipped that section, didn't even put in a primary contingent beneficiary in the application, which is fine. But again, we caught it early on and we said, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Client, we just noticed that you didn't fill in those beneficiaries. Make sure you get that done. We don't want these retirement accounts going through probate because they don't need to. If you name a primary and a contingent or a contingent beneficiary, you should be able to avoid probate, or your estate should be able to avoid probate. This also goes for non-retirement accounts, by the way. So if you have, let's say, bank accounts or non-qualified brokerage accounts or investment accounts, oftentimes you can name what's called a transfer on death instruction or a TOD or a POD designation on those accounts, which actually have it. That's essentially the equivalent of a named beneficiary, and those could also avoid the probate process. So just in short, do yourself a favor and just make this part of your process. Check those beneficiaries, even health savings accounts. Oftentimes those are overlooked. And all of a sudden now those accounts have built up for 15, 20, or 30 years. Check those health savings account beneficiaries as well. Second thing is don't fall in love with your company stock. Okay. And create a process to diversify out of it. Okay. It's great that if you work for one of the big tech companies, you've been riding this wave over the last decade with Google and the Magnificent Seven, just skyrocketing prices, which is phenomenal. I mean, that's carried the stock market globally, for the last several years. And that's great. But if a large portion of your compensation is coming from your employer's stock, and you don't have a process to take some of those chips off the table and diversify it, it's going to be very painful from a tax perspective down the road. So if you can have some kind of system and process, every time you get additional shares vesting, okay, you're already going to recognize income taxes on that cost basis and when it's granted to you. But now we could take advantage of either short or long-term capital gains and losses and get some of those assets off of the balance sheet, diversify it so you don't have such a concentration in your company stock, okay? Because now we're running into some clients now that are in their 50s and 60s approaching retirement, and all of a sudden 70% of their net worth is in their company stock, and it's going to be very painful from a tax standpoint to unwind that. The third thing I'll throw out there, a quick little hitter, is net unrealized appreciation, okay? Ran into this with a client who's working for JP Morgan Chase, has, close to $300,000 of his company stock inside of his 401k plan. Okay. So he was going to roll over his funds into an IRA. He's getting ready to retire. He wants to move it out of his 401k, get it into an IRA, increase the number of investment options in there, and also create a system and a process to set his portfolio up for income distributions as opposed to growth now that they're in that retirement income phase. But the one decision that we needed to make was, what are we going to do with that company stock? Okay, but because he could liquidate that stock and roll it to an IRA and continue that tax deferred growth, but net unrealized appreciation is available within these qualified plans, within these 401ks, where you can actually get that company stock out of the 401k. You would pay taxes on that cost basis. So whatever you paid or your company paid when those shares were granted to you, you would pay ordinary income taxes on that cost basis. But now you have a capital gains tax realization on the growth and earnings on that account, as opposed to ordinary income taxes. So again, if you're working for a publicly traded company and inside of your 401k plan, you have company specific stock, there could be an opportunity there for you to see, hey, does it make sense for you to go ahead and pursue the net unrealized appreciation strategy with that particular account? With that client in particular, we elected to skip over it. He didn't want to recognize the income taxes on the cost basis, and he also wanted to just really simplify and get diversified out of that company specific stock. He wanted just more of a system and a process in place to manage risk and also keep real things very, very simple for his spouse if something were to happen to him. So that's it for the quick hitters. Again, hope you found value in that. But why don't we jump into the content we're going to be talking about today? So how much do you need to spend in retirement, or how much should you be budgeting to spend in retirement? So why don't we start with the most popular rule of thumb? If you go out there and say, hey, how much do I need to spend, or how much should I budget for retirement? You might see a replacement ratio rule of thumb out there. And a replacement ratio is, let's take your current gross income and let's take a percentage of that. And that's how much you need to replace in retirement. And the rule of thumb that I see oftentimes thrown out there is either a 75% to 85% replacement ratio. So if you're making $100,000 a year before taxes, the replacement ratio says you're going to need to replace about $75,000 to $80,000 in retirement. Okay. So why is that? Why do you have a reduction in spending? Well, I'll link an article on this one, but essentially the theory is that people spend less in retirement. Okay. So essentially what they're saying is now you're not in saving mode anymore. You're in spending mode. So if you were saving, let's say 10% of your gross income towards retirement, well, you don't need that part of your income because now you're in consumption mode. So that's fine. What about taxes being lower? So, payroll taxes, those going away. Potentially you're in a lower federal income tax bracket. Maybe you're also retiring to a no state income tax like our state of Florida here, or Tennessee or Texas. Okay. That's the reason why the assumption is that your spending is going to go down. So 75 to 80% is a good ballpark. And I have found this to be true. Okay. Because what we're trying to figure out is the net spending need. Okay. So if you're currently used to making $100,000 and we're replacing $75,000 net after taxes, I found that to be pretty accurate. Okay. For most individuals. But there are, again, it's not perfect. Like I mentioned, there's not a one size fits all. And you need to look at your current budget to see, hey, what are some of those expenses that might actually come off the books in retirement? You know what I mean? Or, hey, maybe I'm actually a really aggressive saver. I'm saving much more than 10% of my income. I'm saving closer to 20 to 25% of your income. Okay. Well, maybe 75 or 80 might even be too high. You might want to even back that down to come up with that minimum spending need that you need to sustain throughout your retirement. So there's no one size fits all, but I think sort of getting the rule of thumb there, figuring out that benchmark, and then customizing this to compare to what you're actually spending is a good starting point. One way to go about doing this for you specifically is actually come up with your own break-even number. Okay. So how do you come up with this? Really simple. It's just what is going into your bank account every pay period. Okay. Or every month or every year. So what actually goes into your bank account after you've paid taxes? So after you've had taxes withheld and after you've saved in any sort of qualified plan for retirement. So right there, we're customizing that figure, that replacement ratio figure to sort of dial in how much you're withholding for taxes and how much you're saving for retirement. And whatever that after tax number is, let's say it's, $10,000 on a monthly basis. We would assume using that break-even point number or that break-even number, we're assuming that is going to be your spending need that first year in retirement. Of course, at that point, now we need to adjust for inflation, which we're going to talk about here in just a second. Now, if you are saving additional dollars outside of your qualified plan, okay, so let's say that 10,000 hits your account and then automatically you have an auto debit of, let's say, 2,000 a month that's just going to an after-tax brokerage account that you're investing every single month. Well, maybe your replacement ratio, or maybe your break-even number is actually closer to 8,000 a month as opposed to 10,000 a month. But I think coming up with that break-even number, figuring out what's actually going into your account each month or each pay period is a really good starting point. And a great way to go about doing it is just assume you spend it all. Okay. Because even if you're saving some of that, all right, even if you're saving a little bit, let's say in an after-tax brokerage account, or even maybe you're maxing out a Roth IRA. Okay. So just because you're not in saving mode anymore, you're going to be retired. Okay. So what that means is every single day is going to feel like a weekend. And especially in that beginning phase of retirement, you might have the propensity to want to do the things that you've always wanted to do, but just didn't have the time. Maybe it's bucket list travel. Maybe it's an epic golf trip that you've always wanted to take, a luxury cruise, or flying first class to Europe and taking the Eurorail all over the place. I don't know what your goals are, what your travel goals are, but what I have found is, and actually practicing for the last 15, 16 years, is that people oftentimes will spend a little bit more in the beginning of retirement. Okay. So this is actually counterintuitive to a lot of these rules of thumb with replacement ratios. And I just think it's just kind of the nature of the type of client that we're serving. Okay. If you look at the average expenses for someone who's over 65, I'll link this article in here as well. GoBankingRates.com put out this article earlier in the year, and it broke down the average spending for a 65-year-old. And it basically assumes that individuals over 65 are spending on average about $52,000 per year. Okay. I would say my clients are at least spending about double that, probably, north of $100,000 a year, closer to, potentially $200,000 a year of net after tax spending. And so my point is, a lot of the expenses could be discretionary expenses in the beginning, and that's okay. Okay, this is your retirement. You've worked hard to get here, and it's your time to enjoy the fruits of your labor, so to speak. The takeaway that I had from this GoBankingRates.com article was the average retiree over 65 was spending about, about $52,000 a year, and that equates to about $4,345 a month. But then it broke down the retirees into two distinct phases. Ages 65 to 74, so young retirees, spend about $4,800 a month. And then folks over 75 spend on average about $3,800 a month. So about $1,000 less, or 21% reduction in spending after that first phase in retirement. You've probably heard me talk about this before many times in the show, but the idea of these spending phases, okay, and that's what really resonates with a lot of our clients, is that, hey, in that early phase of retirement, you might be spending a little bit more. Okay, so whatever that replacement ratio is that you're coming up with in that first year of retirement, maybe you add another 15 to 20% during those go-go years, as we like to call them. And that could last for, let's say, 10, 15, or 20 years until you start to slow it down a little bit. Okay, and then you enter the slow-go years where your spending begins to go down. And then later in retirement, now you have the no-go years. Now you're not doing any of that travel. Family's probably coming to see you instead. All right. So all in all here, if you're not a budget tracker, it's okay. You can come up with, use some rules of thumb. Again, use that 75 to 80% of replacement ratio. And these are the facts and figures. If you're working with an advisor, this is what you need to provide to them. Hey, if I'm making, let's say $200,000 a year, I want to budget for about $160,000 a year of spending that first year in retirement. Or maybe you're calculating your break-even number. Maybe you take your total salary, you're taking out your expenses, you're taking out taxes, and whatever that after-tax figure is that's hitting your paycheck or hitting your bank account every paycheck, that's what you're giving to your financial advisor. If you're a DIYer, that's the number you want to use that first year in retirement, okay? What's going to be helpful for you is once you have this replacement ratio number down, once you have that retirement income spending number down, that you compare that to how much you would need to withdraw from your portfolio on a before tax basis. Okay. So let's say you needed about $80,000, or maybe it's $85,000 per year of spending. Well, you may need to gross that up a little bit to account for taxes, especially if you're taking money out of a qualified plan, a tax deferred IRA or a tax deferred 401k. And so I think comparing that number, that before tax spending number, to your total portfolio to come up with your initial rate of withdrawal is going to be super helpful for you to compare also against that benchmark that we use, a 4% rule. Okay. So if you needed to withdraw $100,000 from your investments, and let's say your total portfolio is about $2 million, that's going to be a starting withdrawal rate of about 5% that first year. Slightly higher than the 4% benchmark, but very much in line with what I would consider to be a safe rate of withdrawal. Okay. But also take into consideration that there may be some different phases that you go through in retirement that you're spending a little bit differently from the portfolio during each of those phases. Okay. So in those go-go years that I mentioned, that early phase of retirement where you're spending a little bit more on discretionary items like travel, you may find yourself withdrawing slightly higher than 4%, maybe significantly higher than 4%. Maybe it's even 6% or 7% a year. But knowing that, hey, at some point in time, maybe after the go-go years are done, now the slow-go years kick in. Now expenses go down a little bit. And now you're starting to take Social Security. Maybe you waited until 70 to start drawing Social Security, and now you can turn on that switch. And now your withdrawal from investments not only drops because you're spending less, but also because you have other income streams coming into the picture. So super important there to kind of set yourself up mindset-wise to say, hey, what are those different phases in retirement that I go through? And how does my spending, how do my spending changes over time? How does that align with different income sources kicking in over time, like Social Security, like we just mentioned, or like required minimum distributions, which for most people will either kick in at age 73 or at 75. So I think coming up with a different spending phase rate of withdrawal in each of those phases is going to be super valuable to see if there's any phase where you're significantly overspending way above that 4% benchmark, and make sure that there's a plan to drop that down at some point, or a plan to accommodate for market conditions causing you to need to make adjustments to your rate of withdrawal in your portfolio. I think the good news is, for a lot of you retirees out there, or folks that are planning for retirement, if you're working with a financial planner, there's going to be some sort of assumption built into there for two things. Number one, your expected rate of return, which hopefully it's a reasonable expectation. This is something that can really overinflate a financial plan. If your advisor is using really optimistic return assumptions for stocks and bonds, that could really, it could give you a false sense of security. So I like going a little bit more conservative, for a 60-40 portfolio, 60% in stocks, 40% fixed income. I don't see why you would need to assume higher than a 5 or a 5.5% rate of return over time. Okay, I think that keeps you on the safer side, because historically speaking, a 60-40 portfolio has returned closer to 7% annually. And so I think just preparing for potentially lower returns over the next decade or two, just in light of what we've gone through over the last 10 years, probably the prudent way to go. But the other key input in there is inflation. Okay, what are going to be the inflation assumptions? And this is obviously a big topic in the news. Inflation dropping now to 3.4%. People are feeling better, but still people are not feeling great about inflation, because that's been embedded now into our economy for the last 2 years plus. And it's not transient. It's actually a lot stickier than I thought anyone believed, even myself included. And Jay Powell he's had a tough job over the last couple of years in figuring out this rate cut strategy relative to this rate increase strategy. So now that I think the market's in agreement that rates are probably not going to go higher from here, but now they've leveled off. The Fed has held steady the last 2 meetings, and now our rate's going to come down going forward. All right. The Fed's goal for inflation is 2% a year. All right. And so I often see financial planners out there, they'll build into their models, let's say a 2% inflation rate. I think there's some risk there, because what if inflation is substantially higher than that? What if we go through a period like the 70s and 80s where inflation does get a little bit out of control? Okay, maybe it's closer to 3% a year, 3.5% or 4% a year. Assuming a 2% inflation number could be a risk there. So I like to eliminate those uncertainties and say, hey, let's plan for a slightly higher inflation rate, maybe closer to 3% a year, which is what we currently build into our portfolios. But the good news is for you retirees is that oftentimes this is a very harsh and a very overly conservative assumption, because studies have shown that retirees do not increase their own expenses with inflation over time. Okay, oftentimes their expenses are fixed. Okay, much more than folks that are in their working years, that are paying for childcare, raising children. Okay, so oftentimes what we see, and studies have shown this, is that retirees lag inflation in terms of their increases in spending year to year by about 1% annually. Okay. So if someone is assuming inflation is 3%, well, typically a retiree that year is going to increase their expenses by only 2%. Okay. So that's a factor in there to consider. Now, would I recommend this right off the bat, just saying, hey, let's just lag or spending by inflation? Probably not. Okay. But I told you I was going to go through my favorite methodology from a spending standpoint. My favorite method is using those spending phases, sort of saying, okay, let's come up with a replacement ratio. And let's say the replacement ratio is 80% of income. And that's your income floor. Okay. That's how much you need to spend to basically keep the lights on, pay your fixed expenses, maintain your dignity, maintain the similar standard of living that you've enjoyed for the last several decades. So we have that number, but then we build in these discretionary spending numbers on top of that. Okay. So for example, we might include an additional line item for go year spending. And maybe that lasts for 10, 15, or maybe even longer. Maybe if someone is in Superman or Superwoman health, maybe they're retiring earlier and they plan to really go hard with travel for 15 or 20 years. And maybe we have those go years last until age 70 or 75. Okay. That's fine. And then at some point down the road, we'll start to slow it down. So that lag in inflation, we're kind of building that into that next phase of retirement when typically people do start to slow it down. Maybe it's 75, maybe it's closer to 80 for some folks. And at that point, we'll cut spending by, let's say, 20 or 30% on the discretionary spending front. And then that period will last for another 5 or 10 or 15 years. And then we'll build in a final line item for the no-go years, or just eliminate that discretionary spending altogether. Okay. Because what we find is that there's this concept out there called the retirement spending smile, where essentially if you plot your expenses over time on a line graph, you'll see that your expenses will start out a little bit higher and then go down over time because it's lagging with inflation and you're slowing it down. But then it'll increase at the very end, making that smile curve, because healthcare costs tend to go up later in retirement. Okay, like long-term care, custodial care, for example. So I think having a plan and a process to say, hey, let's not overspend for sure, but let's also make sure we don't underspend, especially in those go-go years when you are still healthy. You're still able to do those trips together that you've dreamed of for many, many years. Take those, do those things, build that dream house, get your house, build your forever home. All right. Take care of those things, but also make sure you're not overspending, okay, in those early phases, because you need to make sure you have something left over, some kind of buffer towards the end of life, whether it be to take care of legacy goals that are important to you, or take care of long-term care costs that might rear their ugly head at the end of your life. Okay. Or just accommodating for additional inflation or longevity risk. If you lived longer than anticipated in the financial plan, or if inflation was higher than you anticipated, making sure you have a buffer there. And the last thing I'll point out there is, on those spending phases, oftentimes what we see in that beginning phase, those go-go years, oftentimes retirees are kind of like, hey, we want to make sure we're taking care of our own budget first. But maybe some of the initial modeling that we're doing, maybe it does show some capacity to do some giving during lifetime. So whether that's gifting to children or grandchildren during lifetime and taking advantage of the annual exclusion without having to file a gift tax return, maybe that's something. Or maybe it's building in some charitable giving as part of their retirement income budget over time. Maybe that's something that they want to do as well. But in that beginning phase, that early phase of retirement, it's a little bit uncomfortable to do that because they just want to make sure that their plan is working over time. And so what I see is that those go-go years, oftentimes it's focused on all of those bucket list items and that go-go year mindset of spending. And then in the slow go phase, even though your discretionary expenses might go down a little bit, oftentimes I see this is when gifting starts to go up as well. Because maybe they've been retired for 5, 10, or 15 years. Maybe their portfolio has increased at a higher rate than what they're withdrawing from the portfolio. So even though they've been retired and they're taking income out of their portfolio, their balance is continuing to grow. And all of a sudden, they kind of finally realize, wow, my projections were on track, or maybe my projections were too conservative. Now I even have a little bit of a buffer in my portfolio. Maybe I start to do some gifting to my adult children now while I'm alive, to sort of give with the warm hand as opposed to a cold one. Or maybe I do some additional charitable giving. Maybe I've been giving $5,000 a year. Now I want to increase that to $10,000 a year or $15,000 a year. Maybe required minimum distributions have kicked in, and maybe you want to do some qualified charitable donations from those required minimum distributions. And so you could build that in as part of your budget. And that's what I was saying earlier about, these spending phases. While I typically do see these studies are fine, these rules of thumb for replacement ratios and reducing spending in retirement. But I will say, oftentimes, especially if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably successful. You've probably done a good job saving already. Thinking about, hey, it's not just going to be about spending on yourself during retirement, but it could be giving. It could be helping your granddaughter with their wedding, or it could be helping your granddaughter or grandson with their college education. Okay. And so building in some capacity to do that is a really, really good practice when you're running those projections early on to sort of accommodate for not only your expenditures in retirement, but also for some potential wants or wishes during your retirement years. And that's the framework I like to break things down as to what are your needs, what are your wants, and what are your wishes. And once we can navigate those down, we can figure out a way to accommodate those needs with as much guaranteed income as possible from, let's say, Social Security or pension or annuity income. and then taking care of some of those wants and wishes from discretionary spending, like spending from your portfolio as an example. So bottom line here is there are some ways outside of getting a detailed budget to figure out how much you need to budget for in retirement that will give us what a potential withdrawal rate is for you from the portfolio that first year. And then you can then compare that to the benchmark, that 4% rule. Again, it's a benchmark, 4%, and it's a very conservative benchmark. So even if you're falling, let's say at 5 or 6%, don't be sounding the alarm bells like, oh my gosh, my plan is going to fail, but just make sure, hey, is there a point in time you're going to back that down because you're spending less in retirement or because Social Security is going to be kicking in, those types of things. All right. But then thinking about, hey, there could be some different phases in retirement that I go through, in the go-go years, in the slow-go years, in the no-go years where you're spending a different dollar amount on discretionary items, like travel or other discretionary spending that you might have, and thinking about, hey, let's accommodate for us reducing that spending over time, but let's also account for potentially wanting to spend more on other things like charitable giving or gifting to our family members, or maybe it's just having a buffer in for healthcare. So even though your personal expenses might go down, you may still want to have a similar level of spending adjusted for inflation during retirement. And the last thing I would really advocate for, especially if you're working with a financial advisor and they're running some kind of Monte Carlo simulation for you, don't run into this trap of, trying to plan for this 99 or 100% probability of success. Okay. Again, you think about your college career, and we all had that one professor that it was impossible to get an A. It doesn't matter how hard you worked and how well you scored on certain, it was just impossible to get an A in their course. And, essentially the course was graded on a scale. And the Monte Carlo, I feel, is that professor. Okay. The Monte Carlo is a very strict test where it's going to run typically 1,000 different iterations of rate of return. And it's going to give you that percentage in terms of probability of success. And again, it's very tough. It's very harsh because it assumes that you do not run out of money, assuming no adjustments or changes over time. And we know that, if things did get bad, if we did go through some hard times, you'd likely make an adjustment for a period of time. You wouldn't just continue to spend an additional 20 to 30% on discretionary spending. You might drop that down by, let's say, 5, 10, or 15, or even 20%, or even 100%, during that period of time. And so the Monte Carlo could really force you into underspending early on, especially if you're planning for a really high probability of success. And this especially goes true for those of you that leaving a large legacy isn't super important to you. You should not be planning for a 90 or 95% Monte Carlo score. You could probably get away within the 65% or even 70% probability of success. Because really what that number is, what's the likelihood of you needing to potentially make an adjustment during retirement? That's actually a better way to frame it up. Where if you're operating under the 99%, there's only a 1% scenario where you would need to make any adjustments during retirement, which could be nice, for a lot of you, who are worry-warts. Maybe you're super concerned about the worst case scenario. But for those of you that are like, hey, I don't want to leave a massive amount to my children. I've already paid for their school. They're independent. They're doing better than me financially. I don't need to leave them any assets. You don't need to be planning for a 90 or 99% probability. Again, you could be in that 70 or 75 or 80% probability of success. So just keep that in mind as you're building in these assumptions for your financial plan. Make sure you have those inputs dialed in, that retirement date, that retirement start date, how much income you need to replace, breaking down those different spending phases during retirement, accounting for some potential, not only your needs, but also some of your wants and wishes, especially related to gifting or charitable giving during your lifetime. And just be flexible, okay? Because listen, planning is a process. It's not an event. Okay. So what you put in there into your financial plan, while it is very important, it doesn't have to be set in stone. And oftentimes what I see when folks actually retire, we can have this perfect budget in there. And then we can say, hey, we're going to withdraw from the portfolio X in order to accommodate for that shortfall. after 6 months, after 9 months, we're going to have a really good idea if that's the right number. Okay. And again, my experience is that oftentimes expenses, especially discretionary, they pop a little bit early on and then they taper off and go down later on in the slow go years. So don't be surprised if it, in your mind, hey, let's plan for an 80% replacement ratio, but don't be surprised if you actually want to get closer to 100 or 110% of your income pre-retirement to account for some additional spending during that honeymoon phase of retirement, so to speak. Well, that's it today, everybody. I hope you found the show helpful. Again, make sure to leave that 5-star review. Make sure to give us a follow if you are finding value in what we're putting out there. We appreciate it. It helps us reach more people, which is what we're all about here. We'll make sure to link some of the sources that we talked about in today's episode, some of those third-party articles. And if you're interested in working with me one-on-one, we still are accepting clients in 2024. We start by filling out the Retirement Readiness Survey Review. It's a questionnaire. We'll also link that in the show notes. So you can literally it's just a real simple questionnaire for us to just get to know you, where you're coming from now and what you're trying to accomplish in terms of financial independence. So once you send that to us, we'll give it a look, give you our feedback and whether or not we think we could be a good fit to work with you. And we appreciate hearing from all of y'all. It's been great. Even show ideas, content ideas. That is helpful for me. Like I said, my main gig is not podcasting. Okay. I am not a content creator. I am a financial planning practitioner and financial planning firm owner. And so I'm trying to run my business, serve our clients to the best of our ability. And this is something I love to do on the side. Love to take some of the best practices, take some of the potential pitfalls to look out for been doing this for a little while, and folks that we've been working with that have already retired and have been retired successfully for many, many years, and providing that education to a broader audience. So would love to hear from any of you who have ideas for any podcast episodes. We appreciate that. And until next time, this is Kevin Lau signing off.